For decades, the idea of overcoming trauma has been treated as a psychological imperative. Popular culture, many traditional therapies, and even well-meaning advice push us toward a simplistic logic. The past must be left behind. Forget, overcome, move on. But what if this approach, instead of freeing us, keeps us trapped? What if insisting on erasing the pain is precisely what perpetuates suffering? According to Carl Jung, one of the greatest names in depth psychology, this coping model is not only inadequate, it is dangerous. For Jung, trauma does not disappear when ignored. It fragments, dissociates, and continues to operate beneath the surface of the conscious mind. Like a silent virus, it infiltrates thoughts, emotions, and behaviors, taking control of the psyche without the individual realizing it. If left unaddressed with awareness, trauma transforms into what Jung called an autonomous complex, an unconscious energetic core that lives its own life, with desires, reactions, and intentions that often contradict the individual's rational will. These complexes not only survive repression, they thrive in the shadows, emerging in moments of crisis, in patterns of self-sabotage, in repetitive choices that hurt us, as if something within us is determined to relive the same pain indefinitely. Jung observed that many traumatized individuals develop a subtle form of psychic imprisonment, identification with the victim. This is an internal trap where the very identity molds around the trauma. The individual not only experience the pain, they become the pain. And any possibility of healing begins to represent a threat, as it implies losing the only narrative the subject knows about themselves. While conventional psychology often seeks to reduce symptoms or eliminate painful memories, Jung proposes a much bolder and much more transformative path. He invites us not to forget the trauma, but to descend into its depths, confront it, understand it, reclaim what was lost, and ultimately integrate it into the wholeness of being. Trauma, from this perspective, is not an accident to be erased, but an experience that needs to find meaning, not to justify suffering, but to transform it into knowledge, strength, and expansion of consciousness. In this video, we will dive into Jung's revolutionary view of trauma. You will understand why he believed that true healing does not come from forgetting, but from symbolic integration, a deep, symbolic, and above all, human process. And if you carry wounds that have never healed, patterns that repeat without explanation, or a persistent sense that something within you is fragmented, this video is for you. Because perhaps what you are seeking is not to overcome trauma, but to finally become whole. Most people believe that healing a trauma means forgetting it, erasing memories, controlling triggers, stopping the pain. It's such a widespread belief that it has become almost a modern dogma. If you still feel you haven't overcome it yet, if it still hurts, you are failing to heal. But this narrative, this idea that healing is the absence of suffering, is an illusion. And according to Carl Jung, it is a dangerous illusion. In traditional psychology, trauma is often approached as a kind of foreign body lodged in the mind, something that needs to be processed until it is expelled from the system. But Jung had a completely different view. For him, trauma is not an external entity that can be removed like a tumor. It infiltrates the deepest roots of the psyche. And when it is not understood and integrated, it does not disappear. It transforms, specifically, into autonomous complexes. These complexes are dissociated fragments of personality that separate from consciousness and begin to operate independently, like living psychic entities. They are formed when the ego, unable to cope with the emotional impact of an event, isolates that experience from the rest of the psyche. But what is isolated is not annulled. It simply gains a life of its own, acting on the fringes of consciousness. And that's where the real problem begins. An autonomous complex can be activated by any stimulus that symbolically refers back to the original trauma. A phrase, a tone of voice, a bodily sensation. Suddenly, the individual finds themselves reacting explosively or paralyzingly without knowing why. It is not rational. It is not conscious. It is the complex taking control. Jung observed that in these moments, it is as if the personality is hijacked. The subject does not react based on the present, but based on an unresolved past that continues to try to manifest. This is the mechanism behind many irrational behaviors, disproportionate anger outbursts, extreme fear in safe situations, destructive patterns in relationships. And the cruel irony is that the more the trauma tries to be forgotten, the more power it gains in the unconscious. What is not faced with awareness manifests as fate. Therefore, simply trying to move on is not only ineffective, it is a way of feeding the very suffering. It is like trying to heal a deep wound by covering it with makeup. The outside may look more presentable, but the infection continues to grow underneath. True healing requires going down to the root of the pain, facing head-on what has been avoided, and bringing to light what has been pushed into the darkness. But how does this process happen? How can the unconscious be transformed rather than just repressed? And what exactly composes these complexes that seem to have a will of their own? In the next segment, we will explore in depth the nature of autonomous complexes, these psychic entities that Jung discovered and that may already be operating silently within you. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. Carl Jung was one of the first to recognize that the human psyche is not an indivisible unit. It is composed of different parts, many of which operate outside the reach of consciousness. When these parts are shaped by unintegrated traumatic experiences, they gain such an intense emotional charge that they become independent. Jung called these structures autonomous complexes. But what exactly are these complexes? Simply put, a complex is a psychic core formed around an emotionally charged memory, usually pain, fear, shame, or humiliation that has been dissociated from the conscious ego. By being excluded from the individual's conscious narrative, this content fragments and gains a kind of life of its own. Not in the literal sense, but functionally. It begins to act as if it were a separate entity with its own logic, intentions, and way of operating. These complexes are responsible for disproportionate emotional reactions that do not seem to make rational sense. A small criticism triggers an explosion of anger. A compliment generates discomfort, guilt, or even panic. A healthy relationship is sabotaged for no apparent reason. These are not conscious responses. They are activations of complexes. It is the past invading the present. And the most disturbing thing is that these complexes do not act only episodically. Over time, they shape recurring behaviors, limiting beliefs, and even entire aspects of identity. Many people, unknowingly, live much of their lives driven by complexes, automatic patterns that repeat in an almost ritualistic manner, always seeking to resolve what has been left open. But without awareness, all they can do is repeat the pain. Jung observed that unintegrated trauma tends to manifest cyclically. The person unconsciously attracts situations and relationships that mirror the original wound. A pattern of abuse, for example, can repeat with different faces because the unconscious is trying to heal that wound. But without awareness, it can only relive the pain, not resolve it. The mind is seeking closure, but finds repetition. This is a fundamental point. The unconscious is not trying to punish you. It is trying to complete an interrupted story. But when trauma is not faced with lucidity and courage, the script repeats infinitely, and each repetition deepens the whole. However, there is something even more subtle and devastating. In many cases, the complex becomes so dominant that it begins to confuse itself with the self. The person believes they are that. The victim becomes their pain. The rejected becomes the rejected. The abused becomes the fragile. And any attempt at change feels like an existential threat. Because if the pain goes away, who is left? Who am I without this story? This is the trap of identification with the victim, a phenomenon that Jung identified as one of the most powerful barriers to true healing. In the next part, we will delve deeper into this point: how trauma infiltrates identity, why we unconsciously resist healing, and how the narrative of pain can become an invisible prison. Among Carl Jung's most unsettling discoveries is the realization that trauma often not only leaves deep marks on the psyche, it shapes the very identity of the individual. Over time, pain ceases to be just a memory. It becomes a mirror. And when we look into that mirror for too long, we end up believing that we are what we reflect. The victim. This phenomenon is what Jung described as identification with the complex. When a trauma is intense enough and remains unintegrated, it becomes the gravitational center of the psyche. Everything begins to orbit around that pain. The personal narrative, beliefs about the world, relationships, behaviors, everything is filtered through the lens of trauma. And the most frightening part? This happens silently, unconsciously, almost imperceptibly. Identification with the victim is not a conscious desire to suffer. It is not masochism. It is an unconscious attempt to maintain psychic cohesion in the face of internal collapse. In other words, if pain was the most significant experience of your life, if it was the only constant, then your unconscious will cling to it as an axis. Because without it, you may feel that there is nothing, no story, no identity, no self. That is why so many people resist, unconsciously, healing. Not because they enjoy suffering, but because they fear the emptiness that would come afterward. Who would you be without that trauma? Who would you be without the anger that protects you, without the fear that guides you, without the sadness that defines you? Pain can be unbearable, but the uncertainty of the unknown can be even more frightening. And so, we remain trapped in destructive patterns. We return to abusive relationships. We sabotage ourselves in decisive moments. We attract humiliation, neglect, abandonment. Not due to a lack of strength or intelligence, but because there is an unconscious part that believes this pain is all that we have left. Jung saw these behaviors as failed attempts at symbolic resolution. The unconscious is trying to close the wound, but lacking awareness, it can only repeat the original scenario, as if by reliving the same pain, the psyche is hoping for a different ending. But the ending never changes, as long as the story is not rewritten with open eyes. This understanding changes everything. It reveals that the path to healing does not involve forgetting or overcoming, but rather undoing this identity fusion with pain. Relearning who you are beyond the trauma. Dissolving the invisible prison you didn't even know existed. But how is this done? How to undo years, sometimes decades, of unconscious identification? How to separate what is you from what was imposed by pain? In the next part, we will delve into the heart of the Jungian healing process, the three fundamental stages that allow for confrontation, recovery, and integration, and why these stages are often overlooked by conventional therapeutic approaches. Most modern therapeutic approaches focus on emotional regulation strategies, thought change, and symptom control. They attempt to restore the normal functioning of the ego. But Carl Jung saw trauma as something that could not be resolved merely by calming the surface. For him, healing required a descent, a deliberate journey into the darkest basements of the soul, where the trauma was buried and where it still operates in the shadows. This journey occurs in 3 profound stages, which form the core of the Jungian approach to trauma healing: conscious confrontation, recovery of lost aspects, and symbolic integration. The first stage, conscious confrontation, demands something that many avoid: looking directly at the wound. Not with intellectual coldness, but with emotional presence. It involves revisiting the pain with open eyes, without dissociating, minimizing, or rationalizing. It is about being there, whole, feeling the anguish without trying to erase it. Jung believed that repression was the greatest enemy of individuation, because everything that is avoided returns, disguised, distorted, and often more destructive. This confrontation is not merely reliving the trauma. It is facing it as a conscious witness. It is the moment when the ego, instead of fleeing or denying, confronts what was fragmented and begins to piece it together. It is the beginning of the self's rescue. But this leads us to the second stage: recovery of lost aspects. When we experience trauma, we do not just lose peace or security. We lose parts of ourselves. A trauma can kill a child's spontaneity. It can silence the voice of someone who once spoke with strength. It can destroy trust, joy, the ability to surrender to love. Jung called this soul loss, essential fragments of the psyche that detach and hide in the unconscious as a form of self-protection. At this stage, therapeutic work is akin to inner archaeology, digging deep to retrieve these parts, not just as memories, but as living potentials that need to be reintegrated into the present. It is not enough to understand what was lost. It is necessary to reincarnate these parts in real life. To laugh again, to trust, to desire, to create, to bring back the vitality frozen by trauma. The third stage, and perhaps the most sophisticated, is symbolic integration. Here, the goal is not to justify the trauma, but to give it meaning. Jung saw the symbol as the language of the unconscious, a bridge between the inner and outer worlds. When we manage to symbolize the trauma, it ceases to be merely a destructive event and becomes a portal to transformation. This does not mean romanticizing the pain. It means recognizing that, by traversing suffering, qualities emerge that would never be awakened otherwise: resilience, compassion, depth, clarity. The wound heals, but leaves a mark, and this mark, when understood symbolically, becomes strength. Jung said, "We do not heal by denying the darkness, but by illuminating it." And this is precisely what symbolic integration accomplishes. The darkness loses its destructive power when brought to the light of meaning. These 3 stages, confrontation, recovery, integration, are not linear. They are spirals. Often, the process requires returning to the pain more than once, revisiting forgotten aspects, finding new symbols. But with each turn, the ego becomes stronger, more stable, more aware. And it is at this point that a fundamental change occurs. The trauma, once a wound that controlled the individual, becomes a scar that teaches. It is no longer the center of identity, but an integrated part of the journey. The pain does not disappear, but it is transcended. In the next part, we will explore exactly this: what it means to live with the scar and not with the wound. What life is like when trauma ceases to be an inner tyrant and becomes a mark of wisdom and transformation. We will talk about true emotional freedom, that which arises not from the denial of pain, but from the full integration of what you survived. If what you're hearing resonates with you, you'll find real value in my ebooks. Beyond the Shadow breaks down Jung's core ideas, while Dialogues with the Unconscious gives you a 30-day path to apply them in your life. Both are linked in the pinned comment. Most people believe that healing a trauma means returning to who they were before it happened, as if there were a pure, intact version prior to the impact. and that healing was a path of return. But Carl Jung dismantles this illusion with surgical precision. For him, true healing is not regressive, but transformative. It is not about going back to an original self, but about becoming someone who would never have existed without that pain. The scar is not a flaw. It is a seal of evolution. When trauma is truly integrated, it loses its parasitic power. It does not disappear. It is not erased. But it ceases to act as an unconscious core that hijacks your identity. Instead of dictating your reactions, it transforms into understood memory. You still remember the pain, but it no longer decides for you. This transition marks a crucial moment in the psychic journey, the replacement of reactive conditioning with conscious presence. You stop living on autopilot, reenacting old wounds, and begin to choose, clearly, how you want to respond to life. Jung described this state as the integration of the personal unconscious into the self. Trauma, when symbolized, becomes part of a larger system of meaning. It aligns with your existential narrative, and thus transforms into a source of wisdom. It is not a theoretical, academic, or merely rational wisdom. It is a type of embodied wisdom, that of someone who has survived the unbearable and emerged from it with expanded vision, strength, and compassion. This transformation does not occur through ready-made formulas nor through denial. It requires crossing over. And at the end of the crossing, what is found is not a corrected version of oneself, but a new psychic entity, more whole, more real, more profound. It is at this point that trauma ceases to be a curse and becomes a turning point. An event that, although never desired, becomes revealing. It reveals where your oldest wounds were. It reveals parts of you that needed to be rescued. It reveals strengths that only emerge in darkness. The scar, in this context, is symbolic. It tells a story. But it is a story you can narrate, not a story that controls you. The difference is subtle, but transformative. Because while the wound bleeds and paralyzes, the scar guides and teaches. It reminds you that you have been at the bottom and returned, that you have been afraid and faced it, that you have been broken and rebuilt yourself with your own hands. Healing, for Jung, is this alchemical process in which the lead of suffering transforms into the gold of consciousness. But this journey does not need, and should not, be made alone. The process of individuation, as Jung called this path of psychic integration, is too demanding to be traversed in complete isolation. In the next and final part, we will talk about what it means to live consciously after the integration of trauma, and why this awareness requires commitment, ongoing courage, and a new relationship with one's own history. We will understand what it is, in fact, to live the present with wisdom, without being dragged by the currents of the past. Healing from trauma is not a finish line. It is a new starting point. When you integrate the experiences you have tried to avoid your whole life, something profound happens. You do not free yourself from the past. You free yourself in the present. Pain ceases to be the center of your identity. Memories continue to exist, but they no longer hold the reins of your existence. Carl Jung taught us that true liberation does not come from repression, but from integration. What you repress becomes your destiny. What you integrate becomes your strength. And that is why the journey inward, no matter how painful and uncomfortable it may be, is always more powerful than escape. Living with awareness after the integration of trauma is not living without pain. It is living without being enslaved by it. It means that even if certain old emotions still visit you, they no longer invade your home without permission. They knock on the door, and now you have a choice. You can welcome them with maturity, understand their origin, and decide how to act. This is the essence of individuation, becoming whole. even with the cracks. And being whole is not being perfect. It is recognizing your darkest parts without shame. It is learning to say, yes, this happened to me, but also affirming, this does not define me. It is living with compassion, not only for others, but for yourself. Because you know what it means to carry the unbearable and to move forward anyway. This psychic maturity does not arise from theories or quick fixes. It emerges from the courage to face your own story with clear eyes and an open heart. When you stop running away from yourself, you finally begin to live as a whole human being. The scar is still there. It always will be. But now, it does not bleed. It shines. If you have made it this far, you may have recognized parts of yourself in this video. You may have seen yourself in patterns that now make sense. And perhaps, just perhaps, you have felt the beginning of an inner call to look at yourself with more honesty and more courage. So now it's up to you. Comment below. Which part of this journey resonated most with your story? What truth have you been avoiding facing? I read the comments and want to know how this content impacted you. And if this video touched you in any way, be sure to like it, share it with someone who needs to hear this, and of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the upcoming content. By the way, the next video is essential for anyone truly committed to their process of self-discovery and transformation. So watch it now. It will be as deep as, and perhaps even deeper than. Are you ready to continue? See you there.